I want to talk to you about one of the major questions I had on my mind recently, the F-35. Specifically, how do we maintain one of the major selling points of the F-35, that is the ability to collect, process and share huge amount of data between the F-35 and other platforms in order to identify, track and engage targets, as well as increase the survivability of the force as a whole. And we of course want to do this at a time advantage over the adversary. Now I want to put this in a framework of a peer-to-peer conflict. So we're way beyond the sub-threshold stuff. We are in a shooting war. Kinetic stuff is flying left, right and center. There's a lot of EW support, so electronic warfare going on with both sides trying to jam each other. And of course we are in a multi-domain operations, which means that air, land, sea, space, and if you want to add cyber to that, we can do so as well, has to act in concert in order to fulfill the goals of each side. And at the forefront of discussion, I'm also going to place the ability to share information not just locally, but globally, beyond line of sight. So you do have to go into domains like space in order to accomplish that. And I think this is quite an important topic. Let's be honest here. If the F-35 cannot share critical information, then the F-35 and the force at large has a problem, which also means that we have a problem, because the F-35 is gearing up to be one of the main assets that NATO countries have, and in fact are going to have in the coming decades. So could connectivity, or the lack thereof, be the fatal flaw of the aircraft? Let's talk about that. So welcome back to Military Aviation History. My name is Chris and I love talking about air power every Thursday here on the channel. Big thank you to all the channel supporters and the patrons who make Military History Day possible. And this video is also done collaboratively with my colleagues at the Freeman Air and Space Institute. And that space component is going to be important because I actually asked an expert there at FASI to give some insight into how to build up a space infrastructure that is resilient and can be used in times of peer-to-peer conflicts, and we're going to hear from him very soon. And I think also in recent years we have once again seen how important satellite communications is for aircraft, not just for navigation and communications and targeting, but also data sharing as a whole. And we also know that the Russians are very keen on jamming GPS and satellite communications where they can. So we'll start out here with the F-35, and we're going to stay on that tactical technical level for now before I branch it out into the wider big picture issues. And we have to of course recognize that when you do a systems to system approach, we need to look for points of failure. So if a single point of failure is in a system, that means that the enemy can exploit that single point of failure and render it mute. We have the conventional Link 16 data link. Now Link 16 is quite limited in many ways, but it's been the standard sort of NATO data link for a long time. And what this provides is just general low bandwidth communications for the platform. So you have positional data can be shared, targeting data then can be shared, specifically like for example GPS coordinates. You can acknowledge or request information via that link. However, it's also a link that as you're sending it out, it's basically a lighthouse. You're unmasking yourself. If the enemy doesn't know you're there already by radar, they definitely know at that point, and that also there's some information transfer going on, which they may not know exactly what information is being exchanged and what orders are being given, but they know that something is going on. And of course you want to maintain ambiguity, which is why that is not necessarily a good thing. In the F-35 then we also have the multi-function advanced data link, and this is basically coming out with the F-35 itself, but it's also being branched out for the other force, and that's a narrow beam, shorter range sort of data link with a higher bandwidth where you can share a lot of information very quickly, very effectively. And because it's narrow beam and directional, you really have to be inside the beam, usually have to be inside the beam in order to intercept it and to realize what's going on. So that's why it's considered a more stealthy form of communication, because it's sent off just in one specific direction rather than being omnidirectional. Beyond that, of course, we also have SATCOMs that came out now with the F-35 Block 4, and there the F-35 can communicate with satellites, and that is being then relayed either from the satellite to another position on the ground or in the air, or through a satellite relay over then to something that's happening on the other side of the planet. So that's how more globally an F-35 can communicate quite effectively. So you can already see that there is some redundancy put in place here. Link 16 is definitely not the same as MALT, and MALT is not the same as SATCOMs. These systems function very differently, but you are able to share information across more than just one system and can work around certain issues should something occur. Of course, with jamming and so on, you're not going to be directly jamming the F-35 that is actually transmitting the information. Generally, you want to go for receiver jamming, because that's generally how jamming works. Now, the same goes with navigation. You have, of course, satellite GPS navigation, so sat-nav, but you also have INS. So if you're somehow able to take out or jam the satellite GPS network, or jam the F-35 and being unable to receive those signals, then you still have an INS system that is incorporated into the aircraft. And yes, INS does create some sort of drift over time, but if it's properly calibrated and recalibrated over time, that should not be an issue. So again, we have some redundancy put in place there as well for data links, communication, as well as GPS and navigation. So there is our baseline now. And now let's start zooming out, because even though we've already appreciated that both on a technical level and a tactical level, we have ways to get around certain issues, once we go on a force level, it gets really, really interesting. So I'm going to say that we have 5 players in the mix. We have the F-35, and then we have air, land, sea, and space. I'm not going to add cyber in this, right? And the F-35 has links to all of those. So it has links to other aviation platforms, it has links to ships, it has links to ground stations, and it has links to satellites, and those also have links in between them. And just like on the tactical level with the F-35, the adversary can act against all these players as well, or against the links of that. So it does this either via kinetic means or via non-kinetic means. Specifically here, we can talk about the F-35 or other air assets that can be targeted by air defense or fighter intercepts, or in fact by electronic warfare jamming right there. And there's other ways to deny that sort of operation as well. For example, if you hit the basing of an F-35 and the F-35s cannot be based in theater, then that's going to actually decrease the ability of the force to field an F-35 there in the area, collect all that information and send it back home, because it's not there in the first place, or it has to fly longer missions with enabler support, with air-to-air refueling and so on and so forth. So there you go as well. You could also theoretically go after the enablers if that's possible, although they usually are at ranges where you can't really get to them, but that's another option as well. So that's how you could act against the air domain in that regard. Satellite communications, let's talk about that briefly. You could go ASAT, you can fire a missile at a satellite. The Russians have the capabilities, the Chinese have recently demonstrated that they have that capability, although with the Kessler syndrome, it is something that is sort of a hit and miss thing for everyone involved. Directed energy, sort of lasers are in the works. That's probably going to be a thing in the future. EW jamming, so once again jamming satellites. If you have a strong enough transmitter, or if you have a transmitter in space that can get close enough to the satellite that you want to jam, there's an option. The Chinese have also demonstrated that they can actually have another satellite who flies towards the satellites and then grabs it and pulls it out of place. They've recently demonstrated that as well. So there's options there to act as well. It is complex, it increases the complexity of what you're trying to do, but those options exist. And then of course, as I was saying, with electronic warfare, you can go after the links, so the uplink or the downlink, jam those receivers if you know where they are, and go from that. So what we're seeing in this matrix here is really that, yes, while systems can act against systems, and while every system does have a counter to it, it starts getting very complex, because there's that redundancy in place between the links. If you want to relay information, for example, globally, then yes, you can go via the satellites. If the satellites suddenly don't become feasible anymore, then you may, yes, this is going to be slower, but it does work. You can, for example, relay that information via the ground to the position that you actually want to get the information for. And yes, that's going to really require you to relay the information to land, and then land has to go to another land station perhaps, and that land station then sends it off to another aircraft, and that aircraft then sends it further down the line to another aircraft, and that aircraft then sends it down to the ground station where it's actually supposed to be. Perhaps because of the curvature of the Earth, you're sort of hopping around instead of just going straight for the satellite. But it works. The data is going to arrive not at the same speed, but it is going to arrive at least. Just because you are able to take away the F-35's ability to communicate with just one system doesn't mean that you can take away the ability to communicate with everything. Now, as we're going into the big picture here, I realize that it is going to be somewhat abstract, but I will bring it back to the F-35 again. So how do we increase the survivability of the whole force that I talked about? And that is essentially by increasing the costs for the attacker in order to take it out, even the individual nodes in that force. So what you want to do is you want to decrease the margin of credible success probability for the attacker with the resources that they have in hand, which causes them to invest more into those sort of capabilities, which of course results in them not being able to invest those sort of resources and that sort of manpower into something else. Incredibly abstract, but it goes into the concept of deterrence by either punishment or denial. But what does this have to do with the F-35? Well, let's think back about the force structure that we have right here. Yeah? You're not just acting against the F-35, you're acting against everything. You have to jam satellites, you have to jam fleets, you have to jam ground bases, you have to jam other aircraft, and not just jam them, you have to send missiles, you have to take them out, you have to destroy them, you have to, essentially take out individual nodes across this whole network in order for the F-35s to be unable to communicate effectively with all of them. And yes, of course, that's what happens in a shooting war. You're taking pot shots at specific things when you can, and you also are running larger operations where you take out dedicated points of your adversary. That shows you that it's not as simple as just saying, oh, we're just going to jam that aircraft that is in the sky because that's going to make everything so easy. No, there's redundancy in play on a tactical, technological level, with that aircraft being able to send information in multiple ways, as well as then the force structure being able to bounce back once you take out certain nodes within that and just relaying information the other way. But of course, this is a very air-centric approach. I'm looking at this from sort of the F-35's perspective. So I want to hand it over to Aleix Campos at this point. He is a colleague of mine at the Freeman Air and Space Institute, and he recently published a paper on how you can build up, via a certain strategy, a very resilient and redundant system in space that then would provide that structure that can also be exploited by aircraft like the F-35 in order to pass on information globally.
So outer space is essential to streamline the effectiveness of multi-domain operations. And that also, of course, includes the air domain. So, for instance, if you take the F-35 or any other fifth-generation aircraft and its dependence on GPS, often GPS is thought in terms of navigation and positioning. As a fighter pilot, that means essentially knowing where you are at all times. But GPS is also about the timing signals so that the aircraft can receive and transmit data to the mesh network that it's part of. So it is not only about making the F-35 more survivable, but it is also about making the F-35 missions more effective. And this is one of the main challenges that space-dedicated organizations have historically faced, namely how to ensure that the protection of space-based systems is part and parcel of the defense planning process of their countries. But in what ways can space-based systems be protected from anti-satellite attacks? Several strategies that you can use, and I'm going to be discussing 4 of those. So the first strategy that can be used to ensure the continuous support from space to the warfighter is a disaggregation strategy. This strategy effectively distributes different missions, ISR, SATCOMs, for example, across various satellites or payloads that are located in different orbital regimes. So, for example, a country like the UK could use satellites from geostationary orbit, which is further away from Earth, to communicate with its nuclear-armed submarines. And then use satellites from low Earth orbit, closer to Earth, to transmit near real-time ISR data to the cockpit of an F-35. The objective is to prevent various missions from being concentrated into the same satellite constellation, which might provide an easier target for adversarial anti-satellite systems. So, for instance, if an F-35 relies on a higher number of cheaper satellites in low Earth orbit, rather than on few exquisite capabilities, then it can minimize critical points of failure and ensure that the fighter jet's targeting loop will not be disrupted. So the second strategy, based on deterrence by denial, that can be pursued is a diversification strategy. This strategy aims to ensure that the mission cannot be degraded by either using various satellites, placing assets in different orbits, and or capitalizing on commercial capabilities or those of allied systems. So in a nutshell, it's about having access to redundant capabilities. That's the main principle. And I realize that this might sound slightly similar to the previous strategy. The main difference is that here we are diversifying the same mission set across different platforms. This aggregation is about distributing different missions across different orbits. But of course, these strategies are complementary. A country can first disaggregate different missions and then diversify one of these missions across multiple platforms. So, for example, if an F-35 pilot wants to ensure that they have access to positioning, navigationing, and timing, the aircraft can use interchangeably the encrypted signals from the US GPS and the European Union's Galileo system. That, of course, implies that the aircraft needs to have receivers that are compatible with both GPS and Galileo systems. So if one of the systems is targeted by an adversary, the pilot then can switch, so to speak, and use the alternative system. So the third pathway to enhance the protection of space-based missions is proliferation strategy. And it follows the same principle as the previous strategy. Namely, it seeks resilience through redundancies. Essentially, it's about deploying a large number of the same platforms, payloads, or systems of the same types to perform the same mission. The major difference with a diversification strategy is therefore that this one implies the ownership of the constellation. So it is a sovereign-based strategy. Having hundreds of satellites to provide ISR data to the cockpit, or several satellites that process data from other sensors to transfer actionable information in near real time to a fighter pilot, these are some of the examples that fall under this strategy. So if one of the satellites is damaged in light of an anti-satellite attack, then the country can quickly retask other satellites to continue the same mission. The last strategy that air and space forces can implement is the reconstitution strategy, which is also known as responsible space launch. So this is about having the ability to launch satellites on demand to quickly replace degraded or disrupted assets in space. The idea is simple. If an adversary anticipates that the country can deploy additional satellites in a short time frame to, for instance, continue supplying bandwidth to the air forces for communication, then the tactical value of targeting the satellites diminishes. So the US, by 2026, the US Space Force wants to launch satellites in orbit upon request, ideally within a day.
Now, I urge you to read Aleix's paper. Not only is he a good colleague of mine, but I had the pleasure also of seeing him speak at the Air Attaché meeting here in London, United Kingdom, and he gave a presentation there, and it was very well received as well. You have to cut through some of the academic language that is inherent in these papers, but once you look at it and once you sort of start reading on it, I think also you can start appreciating sort of what strategies are involved here, and also how those strategies are in many ways transferable to other domains, like, for example, the air domain. So to sum all of this up, is the F-35 going to be in a shooting war jammed? Yes, that's going to happen. Will things go wrong as military operations are happening? Yes, things always go wrong. But it is rarely system against system. It is about a force, and the F-35 is an integral part of that force package, a very potent part. It's able to collect a lot of information, and it's able to share that information multiple different ways. And it is, of course, also at that point, since it is one of those modern systems, no surprise that it gets so much attention. It is the big fighter that the West is currently pinning up its hopes on for an upcoming confrontation. Well, when I say pinning up its hopes on, of course, there's lots of systems that are in play. I don't want to make the F-35 appear like this Wunderwaffe that is going to win a war single-handedly. I think everybody knows that it's not the case, but it's going to play a vital part because of its capabilities that it has. But because of that attention that it gets, it's also no surprise that it, to some degree, it's an expensive platform. It gets a bad reputation, either through some of the stuff that's in the media, and also, let's be quite honest, by disinformation that is being shared by potential adversaries and troll farms, which is something that has become very obvious in the last couple of years. And I think perhaps if you like this video, you could use this video actually to counter it and say that, hey, yes, of course, this is Lockheed Martin's fancy bird, and yes, it's expensive, but it's not just about this aircraft, it's about how that fits into the force structure. And just because, there is a media headline that says that, I don't know, somebody made a claim that an F-35 got jammed, doesn't mean that that makes or renders the F-35 impotent. It really doesn't. Most likely it was still able to do all the stuff that it wanted to do. But at this point also, I want to hear your takeaways. What do you think about this subject? Have you learned anything? Do you want to add anything? Do you want to push back on anything? Go ahead. I love talking about air power, so I'm always open to new insights that you might have in the comment section below. So put that in there. I also will have a link to all the sources and of course Aleix's paper in the description. Big thank you once again to all of you for watching the video. Also big thank you to Aleix Campos for taking his time and being interviewed, as well as some other people that I talked about when researching this topic, for example Thomas Whittington, as well as Billy Flynn, and well, you know who you are. Big thank you here to all patrons and channel members, and have a great day and see you in the sky.